when we're behaving as leaders who want to have strong opinions, strong authority, strong responsibility, sometimes it makes it difficult to know how to relate to each other. And I think the reason that we started H3X was for us to work that out ourselves, but
Yes.
also to model what it looks like for us to say, okay, here's what we're doing, and then turning around and giving out to the wider audience some of our learnings, failures, and successes so that they can also grow. How does that idea fit into the distributed network kind of rationale that we talk about, especially when it comes to leaders? Hey, welcome back to another episode of the H3X Podcast with your hosts, Mark Gearing and Dave Miller. Of course, I'm at Casey's and you're in New York, as usual, like our hub of recording. Today, we're going to frame up a good conversation where we're going to go all the way back to the very beginning of why we started EH3X, where we discussed the head, heart, and hands of the multiplying church and our leaders. We've been at this about 2 years now, and we wanted to answer the question, why did Mark and Dave even start this to begin with?
Yes, we do. Yeah. It's an important question, Dave, to talk about, like, why do we keep getting on and doing this every week? And where are we going with this thing? And you brought up, maybe this will help kind of frame up a little bit, but you brought up this concept of how do you see any sort of idea or something multiply in a movement sense. And there's three ways that we can talk about that sometimes. And you can talk about things being centralized, you can talk about it being decentralized or distributed in the way that there's ownership and leadership developing. And so in the way that we've approached this podcast and really everything that we do, Dave, we would lean towards that distributed way of approaching empowering and multiplying disciples, leaders, and churches, what that H3X stands for. And so why is that important, and why have we talked about that so much? I think that's what we want to dig into today.
And Mark, you're going to be probably one of the best people that I've learned from to unpack the differences between those ideas that you just shared, those three different kinds of networks. But I think it really comes down to our goal is to model what leadership contributions look like in a distributed network, where we are someone who wants to take authority and responsibility for where we are and what we're doing. And the CFC, or the consistent, the committed, focused, consistent vision that God has given us, but at the same time, demonstrating how we then interact with, network, and serve the wider work that we're a part of and identify with, which is ultimately King Jesus' great commission to see every tribe, tongue, people, and nation come to the throne of Jesus. And when we're behaving as leaders who want to have strong opinions, strong authority, strong responsibility, sometimes it makes it difficult to know how to relate to each other. And I think the reason that we started H3X was for us to work that out ourselves,
Yes.
but also to model what it looks like for us to say, okay, here's what we're doing, and then turning around and giving out to the wider audience some of our learnings, failures, and successes so that they can also grow. How does that idea fit into the distributed network kind of rationale that we talk about, especially when it comes to leaders?
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, and I think that's we're doing this podcast and we're talking about exactly what you just said. It's like we're not getting on here and delivering, hey, here's all of our conclusions and we've got this all figured out. We're actually, honestly, kind of verbally processing on a podcast every time we get on. And so, and I think there's a reason for that, because if you talk about those three different ways that you can see a network emerge, or the way in which we can see authority distribute, is it can be centralized, it could be decentralized, it could be distributed. And most of the models that we have are centralized or some efforts towards decentralization. And you can see all three of those in scripture, in the word. There's obviously those examples of kings, of those that are very centralized. And then you see the 12 tribes of Israel, where there's a little bit more decentralization. And then there's examples of distributed that are good and bad. Some where they're doing everything that's right in their own eyes, that's a bad distributed. And then there's the priesthood of the believer, which is an ideal distributed. And so in this podcast, what we've been doing is saying we want to pursue that the elevation of the priesthood of the believer, and it's going to be a combination of centralized, decentralized, distributed, because God is the centralized leader. And so that there's obviously going to be all three of those elements and then some in our structures, but we're pursuing a distributed approach, which then all of that, Dave, leads us to this place of saying, okay, then what does it look like to be leaders and to influence and help others to walk out this call to multiply disciples, leaders, and churches in light of that? Because there's not just a ton of models, and it does look different than it might if you're pursuing that from a centralized command and control approach. So that's what we're doing. That's what this podcast has been about.
And the truth is, there's so much for us to unpack in these ideas, which we've been unpacking for 2 years. We've just been basically hovering around what does it look like to behave in a movement network environment as leaders, and trying to model that. And everybody who's listened to this has probably been like, well, they used to think this about this, and now they think that about this. And that's exactly the reason why we keep podcasting week after week after week, is because we're in process and we're wanting to say, hey, we're not the authority, we're not the go-to, which sometimes when somebody podcasts, you go, oh, well, is it just because they want to know who Dave and Mark is? Actually, I like to keep my head down a little bit more than I do because of this podcast, right? Where I'm like, if nobody really knows who I am, I can get by with a whole lot more stuff than if somebody listens. It's not like we have millions and millions of listeners anyway. But the point to come back to is to say, we're putting it out there because we're just saying, we want to take what we're learning,
Yes,
and we wanted to let other people see it, understand it. And that is really developing this idea of how a distributed network functions, which is there's not a central leader that tells everybody what to do. So you don't have somebody with a big vision that gathers around a bunch of volunteers to help them, because their vision is really big enough that all they really need is other people to help them out with it. The truth is the Great Commission and King Jesus strategy is well beyond what any one person can do. No matter how big they think their vision is, it's never going to be big enough. But we also have the flip side, which is a completely decentralized network where we are so unconnected and we have so little organization or no organization that we don't actually collaborate and learn from each other and partner with each other
good.
and celebrate each other in a way to know where we're going and what we're doing, because we actually do have a large target, which is people from every tribe, tongue, and nation. And specifically for us here in the United States, our urban center kind of discussion that hubs around those kind of ways in which we want to target those areas. But then you put those two together, and what you have is there might be some highly structured teams within a hub. And as those hubs see more and more learnings and have been at their CFC longer and have more experience and more development, so maybe they're getting a little bit more efficient in the way in which they're doing things, then they can pass on to other parts of the network some of the learnings that they have, which can not show them that, okay, this hub is better than everybody else, so everybody has to submit to them. But we can say, no, we've got learnings that can speed up other people's development, so that another hub that may be behind in terms of experience can accelerate double the speed and learn even faster to become even better at the Great Commission, so that they don't have to spend 10 years like we did in Oklahoma City learning certain things. They can go, hey, I learned that, and what it took us 5 years to learn, they can learn in 5 minutes and go get it done. And that, I think, is the real beauty of that distributed network, is that you have hubs that aren't forced. They naturally develop, because muddy boots leaders will naturally attract people who want to learn. And so if I could really boil it down, Mark, I'd say the biggest difference is that distributed network is based upon leaders who are attracting and are giving away to learners, versus leaders who are attracting followers and are giving them, tasks that they're supposed to take care of, if that makes sense.
It does. It does. Yeah, and we've used these three elements that we've talked about on and off, Dave, on this, and then you and I bounce this back and forth offline as well. But that emerging from distributed, it really, first of all, it requires that phrase we've been using of a muddy boot leader, somebody that's doing it so that those learnings emerge from a context, and then somebody who's in a similar context somewhere else can learn from that, and through that problem solving, you're shoulder to shoulder tackling similar targets, and learning from one another. But those three elements of target. So what does success look like? Are we getting to the goal that we're going after? And then we'll use the other T of tracking, where we talk about how are we doing in reaching that target. Those two pieces allow us to be good stewards of that. And then the problem solving piece, that third element, when we bring that in, that really allows those teams to emerge not from command and control and delegate, hey, go do this task to accomplish my vision, but it allows that to form, and that leader to lead through influence and through action, maybe through behavior and habits that are formed in them and then multiplied into others around them. That leadership looks different than it does if you're delegating to other people to accomplish that vision. So those three elements of target, tracking, and problem solving become super helpful ways to multiply those kinds of teams within that. And so that's really what you said is kind of the point of this podcast episode, is to talk about why have we been doing this. I'd say that's what we've been doing, Dave, is we're getting on here. We're talking about target and tracking, just learning what those things are and learning how to do them more effectively. And then problem solving, even through conversation in this case, but also offline, meeting together in each other's cities and doing those pieces of target tracking and problem solving.
And those three, I think, are the way in which a distributed network learns to collaborate well. I think you're giving super clear direction on, okay, if we want to operate in not the centralized, not the decentralized, but we want a nice mesh of the two. We want the benefits of both worlds. We're living in the radical middle, as always, Mark. We want both. We don't want either or. We're always going, hey, I actually want both. And that those three of that target, tracking, and that problem solving is the way in which that decentralized network can become the distributed one, where hubs can develop and people can interact, but it doesn't require everybody to give up the vision that God has given them. As a matter of fact, it's requiring everybody to live in that vision and to own that vision and to be passionate about that vision, so that when they do come to a problem solving gathering, they're bringing to the table like great content, great experience, and even more great problems. And I think what we're trying to attempt to do, whether we do a very good job or not, other people can tell us, and we're happy for the feedback because we know that we're not always on target. But what we are saying is we're living in the problems, and that's what we're trying to demonstrate. Is we don't know the answers, we know experience, and we're trying to tackle problems. And we want to just develop a community that's just saying, hey, the harvest is the great equalizer. No matter how much you know, once you hit the harvest, we say this all the time, everybody's the same in the harvest. Everybody's going to run into the same problems. And if we can figure out a way to interact on that problem solving, where I'm coming to the table and saying, I want to serve you and you want to serve me. And then we say, break, now go back to the work, not as hierarchy, but as co-laborers, as priesthoods who are all given the authority to go do your work. I mean, that type of environment is very difficult for Westerners to develop, but I think it's super crucial for us to make headway in where we're going and what we're doing, and to develop those relationships required to keep us in unity.
Yes, it is. And some of what we're talking about, Dave, with this, we talk about principle to multiplication and a focus on multiplication. I mean, it's in the title of this podcast, of the X and H3X. And we see multiplication. We're champions of multiplication at the most decentralized level, where we want to see the believer that's come into the kingdom in this last week be equipped and become competent quickly to turn around and share with their coworkers, their family. But some of what we're talking about today is how does that actually multiply at every level, not just with that at that super local level with that believer that's come to faith this last week, but how do we actually see that multiply from city to city, from nation to nation, and that continue to not come back to a centralized person or persons or organization apart from Jesus. And that's uncomfortable and that's hard, and it's not just simple and easy. But that's what we're working out, is how do we become those that actually believe that Jesus is a good leader and is directing this thing at the most macro level. Yes, with that believer here, I think that really is part of the issue, is not just how do we do this? Do we believe that Jesus has got his hand on the wheel and he's directing and leading the multiplication beyond just the micro level, at the macro level, and in the US, state to state, city to city, across that macro environment?
Yeah, and so I want to take that thought and I want to flesh it out with head, heart, and hands. And I want to start off with, we know that in our head. Jesus is the master strategist. He's the one that is called the Great Commission into being, and he's the one that's saying, I will bring about. There's this concept that God's not a predictor. God doesn't predict things with his word.
Right.
God declares things with his word, and because of his declaration, he makes them come into being. There's a big difference between those two. It's not that God's peering into the future and telling us what's to come. It's that God is stating what the future will become because he's going to make it so.
Yes.
And so walking in faith, knowing that every people from every tribe, tongue, and nation is not something that he's hoping will happen. It's something he's making happen.
Yes.
And we're participating in that is huge. The second thing is with our heart. And there's one big thing that I think comes out of First Peter, just because that's where I've been a lot. So it's the place that I'm going to go to explain this idea. But he says that while the people who are living in Galatia and Cappadocia and Asia Minor, he's writing to where Paul's first and third journeys were. Peter is writing to the believers after Paul is already gone. He's rewriting to those believers that were on the first and the third journeys, and they are going under crazy persecution and suffering. And he's saying to them, you will suffer, but know that your brothers and sisters around the world are suffering the same things. And so he basically says this: if you will suffer for a little while, don't get impatient, because the Lord will raise you up at the right time.
Yes.
And I think in our heart of hearts, Mark, one of the biggest barriers that I find in my own life about getting to what you and I are talking about, the reason that I muck it up, is because I get impatient about the Lord raising me up sometimes. I want to make things happen. Wow. And I want to make my opinion heard and my voice heard.
Yes.
But I don't want other people to just hear it. I want them to do it because I know that I'm right. And so when I get ahead and I try to raise myself up too quickly, I usually end up slowing things down because I'm not waiting on the master strategist, Jesus, to take an idea or to take an influence that I have and then waiting on his timing and his strategy to make use of that instead of going out and making it myself. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And so really what then ends up happening is I become the bottleneck. If I'm trying to promote myself or promote what I'm doing, and even if it can be well-meaning, it's not always like that's a bad thing, or I have good intentions with it. But then I can ultimately become the bottleneck if I'm stopping the idea or the thing that God is wanting to multiply from continuing to multiply.
Yeah. And then I think, again, the great equalizer is when we go to our hands. What is my experience? What are my skills? And if I don't have my hands dirty and my boots muddy, then my head and my heart can get really puffed up, because if knowledge puffs up, right? But if I go to work and I'm in the harvest and I'm doing the thing, then it creates a humility because I'm constantly getting smacked down, because it's as hard as for me as it is for anybody else. And I think that's where we get into, with our head, we know the target. With our heart, we really want to track because we want to see this thing get done. And what keeps us from getting impatient is our hands, because our hands are going to push us into that problem solving,
Yes.
because it's hard to do. And there's this balance that comes from all three of those that I think a distributed network can really benefit from,
Yes.
because we know where we want to go. We know we want to get there and we want to keep pushing to make it happen. But then as we do it together, it can create a humility that says, man, we're in this together. It's all difficult. And so we're just here to encourage and spur one another on to love and good works, all the more as we see that day approaching. But I'm just telling you, that big barrier is in my shift whenever I make the jump from I'm
Yes.
sharing so that other people may benefit versus I'm sharing because I think other people should do what I tell them.
Mm-hmm. Yep. 100%.
And it's hard because if I'm in the business world and running my business, I'm in charge and the final responsibility lies upon me. But even if I approach my business in a hierarchical mindset,
Yeah.
then I'm gonna be a bottleneck, because then all the authority relies upon me. Then people don't feel like they have the ability to take ownership, to be a part, to contribute, to do what we're doing together. And then people will throw their hands up and say, oh, I'll just let Dave do it. But if we cultivate, even in a business where I'm in charge of everything, this distributed network mindset says, no, I have ownership and responsibility, and Dave doesn't take care of everything. I should take care of things because I'm a part of this team. It makes the whole thing run better anyway.
Yep. Yes. Amen. Yeah. So I feel like the other piece in there is that centralized approach, Dave. It's more efficient in some ways in the short term. Well, maybe even in the long term, it's more efficient. And it's cleaner. We've talked about this in our different episodes over the last years. And it also doesn't require as much of me just like vulnerability of just putting myself out there and being all in into the whole thing. And so in some ways it's not very attractive to approach it this way of saying, how do I become the kind of catalyst and leader that's modeling it, that's failing forward, that's open-handedly saying, hey, I'm not here because I've got the answers. I'm here because I'm doing it. Would you come do it with me? But the proof is in the pudding. The fruit really shows us, was that a good strategy? Was that a good approach?
And I will also tag onto that to say that the hierarchical network, the centralized network concept, it allows you to be more efficient, short term and long term. It allows you to point to the work. So when someone says, hey, what are you doing? And you want somebody to respect you, or you want somebody to see the work that you're doing, or you want to be able to say, not even in a prideful way, but you want to be able to look around and go, am I accomplishing anything? That centralized network makes it easier to point at
Yes.
what's going on and what's happening. And it allows you to kind of rest and go, okay, we know we're doing something. But here's the big sticker for me. It's
Yeah.
not scalable to
Yes.
the level that the Great Commission needs. I'll go back to a story that, if I can, just for a second, from back in 2015, whenever I first came into the No Place Left world. I wanted to see it, taste it, touch it, smell it myself. And so I went and spent a week in India with an American leader over there. And he was gracious enough to let me just pound him with questions and talking for an entire week. I don't know how he did. I don't know how he survived it, but he did. And one of the questions that I had was, um, how much work is left? Like, you guys are talking about, these massive movements with millions of peoples and hundreds of thousands of churches. Don't you look at that and go, man, that's awesome? And he said, no, the truth is that the birth rate, he made this statement, the birth rate in India in 3.5 days, just 3.5 days,
Yes.
was bigger than all the movement that had happened over the last decade. And that was mind-boggling to me. And I said, what do you do with that? After all this work, God's doing one of the most amazing things that we know in all of history that he's done. We see it, we understand it, we know it. How do you deal with that? Like, you're not even hardly even making a dent. And he said, It's very simple. We have to multiply more.
Yes.
And you
Very good.
cannot do that. You cannot do that with a centralized network. You may be able to point to and celebrate and see tracking in a centralized network way better,
Yes.
but it cannot scale to the level that's necessary for us to get to the completion of the Great Commission. It's that simple. It just won't do it. And I think that's really what drives in my heart, Mark, the reason why
Yeah.
I keep looking like a fool in so many ways is
Yes.
because I know that no matter how good I feel in a centralized network, it's never going to be the contribution necessary to get us to a place where we can multiply more. And that's why I'm wholeheartedly sold out to that distributed network idea without question, without reservation. I'm never going back. Like, that's where I am now because it's necessary.
Yeah. Well said, Dave. I feel like you brought a good consensus point to bringing all that together. And ultimately, we've got to trust Christ that he knows what he's doing. He's a good leader. That I mean, that's what when we talk about this whole way of doing this distributed, it absolutely relies on the fact that Christ is the head. He is
Amen.
a good leader. He does have his hand on the wheel, and he's directing this thing. And that our contribution, whatever it may be, is going to help to accomplish his mission and bring about forth his kingdom. So,
And I put you on the spot and ask you a question about that idea as we finish up for today. How do you balance in your life the pull of New York City's what's left, the gaps, the no place left that still remains in New York City? How do you balance the need and the drive to do something about that with the rest and the comfort in what you just said, that I can't do it all, Jesus is in charge? How do those two ideas keep you in balance?
Yeah, it's a good question, Dave. And I don't have an immediate answer on the spot because it's something I'm going back to wrestling in. And maybe that's even the point, is that it is a tension, and that it's valuable to have those milestones and to have that most important work that I'm going to engage in 2024. That's what I'm wrestling through right now. I'm looking towards the next year. We're about to start the next year, and I'm wrestling through right now. What is the most important work? What, based on our opportunities and resources that we have right now, should we be putting our focus to week? But then I'm also praying and saying, Lord, where are you at work? What do you want us to be doing over this next season? And so there's this eyes on the big picture, and where are the gaps, where are we not yet, and what's our most important work, and moving towards that. But then also just continuing to go back to, Lord, you've got to do this. And where are you already at work that I may not even see? And how do we join you in it? To me, those are those two that tension idea that I've just got to be living in and engaging in regularly. And you don't ever get out of that tension if you're going to keep pursuing both the intentionality and the trusting that the Lord's going to accomplish the work.
Well, that's the purpose of Head, Heart, and Hands, Multiplying Church and Her Leaders, H3X Podcast. How can we model what it looks like to be muddy boots leaders, developing hubs that are then contributing to the larger work that Jesus is doing in a way that can move us all forward as learners, not as authorities? And so we hope that we keep moving in that direction. But after doing this for a couple of years, we thought it'd be fun to revisit back what it is we're trying to model and demonstrate. And if we're failing in that, you guys, just thanks for walking along with us in it, because we're failing first, failing fast, failing forward. And Mark and I are intentionally throwing ourselves out there. And if we look like fools, then maybe somebody else won't. So that's our whole goal with the H3X podcast. And for those of you guys who have sent us encouraging words, for people who have reached out to us and asked for help, or have asked for advice or connections, we're so thankful for that feedback, and we're going to do our best to keep connecting, keep passing along, keep doing everything we can to take the hubs that we're living in and making sure that those keep impacting the work all across the U.S. and wherever else God intends to take it for his glory.
Thanks for listening, for watching. If this content has been helpful for you, please take a minute to rate, review, and subscribe to the podcast. It really helps us to get this content out there farther, to serve Jesus, grow his kingdom, and accomplish the Great Commission until there is no place left. Much love to you guys. See you next time.